And I've been saying it for the last few years. There's wells in Texas that God doesn't know about. And back in the day, folks would drag a rig out and they drill a hole, and if they didn't hit, they just skid the rig over and drill another one. And
All right. Welcome to the Local Energy Podcast. My name's Peter. I'm here with Wade Spear, and our guest today, we got Hawk Dunlap and Les Skinner. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. Happy to have you.
thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is exciting. Hawk, you've been moving and grooving out there, man. You're busy. You got a lot going on. We talked about zombie wells on our one of our last podcasts, and lo and behold, you had some thoughts. So here we are, and we're excited to get this out. It'll go out tomorrow, actually. So everyone's going to get kind of a quick release of this conversation. But I'll kind of let you get us started. I mean, tell us about zombie wells, man.
Well, first and foremost, Les is the one that coined the term zombie wells, and that's kind of gotten to be mainstream over the last few years. And I had often wondered where the name came from, and lo and behold, it was Les put the name in one of his books that he's written. That's the origin of the name. But basically, a zombie well is a well that's been plugged previously, that's returned to life, if you will, and started flowing again. And we are seeing more and more of these happen, not just here in Texas, but all across the nation. California, most recently, Newport was in the news. But these are wells that had been previously plugged that have started flowing again. A lot of the time, it kind of based on several different factors. For us out here in West Texas, it's the over-injection of produced water. In Texas alone, we're injecting, the new data that I have is 30 million barrels a day is being injected into the ground. So here in the Central Basin Platform, you've got wells that were more that were drilled in the 50s, plugged anywhere from the 60s to the 90s, and then we've added all this abnormal pressure, and it have either caused these plugs to fail or they weren't plugged properly in the first place. Hence, that's where the zombie well phenomenon starts. And I have to make a distinction between, there's a lot of talk about orphan wells and zombie wells, and
Right.
two different classifications. Just for clarification, an orphan well is a well that has been abandoned, and there's no operator associated with that well. And here in Texas, they become a ward of the state.
Les, first time I've met you before, but you wrote books about this topic. I guess I'm curious, how did you kind of come up with the name? I mean, were you watching a movie and you're like, oh, that's it, we're going to call it a zombie well, or is there more to this? Give us a little bit of your backstory and kind of what you've done in the past and written.
Well, I'm an engineer. I've worked in the oil field for 53 years, and be 54 next year. But I grew up in the oil field. More especially, I grew up in a company town in the Texas Panhandle, where wells were drilled just all over the place. One of those wells happened to be in the alley directly behind my house. It was probably 25 feet away from our house, and there was a perpetual patch of dead grass out in the middle of this alley, and we never knew what it was. Finally, my father told me that was where an old well had been drilled, but it wasn't plugged properly, and natural gas was coming out of the well, and it was killing the grass. So, bright kid that I am, I dug it up. I thought I'd try to find the old well and see what was going on. Of course, I never found the well, but I had a pretty good hole in the ground, and my older brother came by and he said, well, I can smell the gas coming out of there. I wonder if it'll burn. Sure enough, he threw a match in it and it caught on fire. So we kind of started talking about that old zombie that was out in the alley. And in 21, I wrote a book on well integrity that dealt with workovers and reentries. And I used that term in the book, zombie well being an old dead well that had come back to life. And the name seemed to stick. So we've been using it now for the last 5 years or so, with the notion that it's a pretty good descriptor of what happens to one of these wells. They're plugged, they seem to be completely dead, and then because of barrier deterioration, they begin to leak. Now, Hawk mentioned, and he's absolutely right, that these wells are starting to leak at the surface, but the problem is they can also leak downhole between from one interval to another. And that is probably as serious a problem as we have with the surface leaks. And it's pretty widespread from what we've seen. And that's going to continue in time as these barrier systems that were originally installed continue to deteriorate.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Local Energy. Please remember to like and subscribe to us here on YouTube or Spotify, or check us out at localenergy.com. All right, back to the show.
So do you have an idea of kind of what the scope of the problem is? And I don't even know how many wells there are in Texas. There's got to be a huge number. I mean, we got to be talking hundreds of thousands, right? Do we have an idea of what kind of percentage of these wells you'd kind of classify as zombie wells?
No, Wade, and the problem is we are just now beginning to identify where the zombies are. And the reason is they're coming to the surface and we can spot them. We have no idea how many of those wells are leaking downhole. There are currently about 2 million orphaned wells in Texas. Now, if you just look at that number and say, well, how many old plugged wells are actually leaking somewhere, we're probably in the same number range, but it's just a guess since we really haven't done a statewide survey on the number of leaking wells that may exist.
And I've been saying it for the last few years. There's wells in Texas that God doesn't know about. And back in the day, folks would drag a rig out and they drill a hole, and if they didn't hit, they just skid the rig over and drill another one, and they wouldn't file for a permit or anything like that. And I've tripped over 8 5/8 at surface, and there's no record. You can dig and dig and dig in the archives. We've had people in the archives down in Austin and looking for records for this, and there's nothing. And I was fortunate enough to meet a man in Crane who was had actually, worked around here his whole life. And he's the one, told me the story. He said, oh yeah, I said, we drill a well. If it hit, we send somebody down to Austin and get a permit. And then, if it didn't hit, we just move the rig and try another one. So, that was what they were doing back in the day. So it's really hard to quantify because of historic practices.
What's been the response from operators whenever something like this happens? I imagine you kind of get a wide range of responses, but generally what's the response like there?
Usually denial. That's the first point. It's not our well. We don't know anything about it. We don't know where it is. We don't have any records on it. They're probably telling the truth. They don't have any records on it. As Hawk just mentioned, some of these wells were drilled, and if it turned out to be a dry hole, they just moved the rig over 300, 400, 500 feet and drilled another hole, hoping to hit something. And if it did, then there were some records created. On that first well, there may not be anything at all. And there's another issue, and that is that states started to regulate the oil and gas industry back in the 1920s. The last state was Indiana. It didn't start regulating wells until 1946. So that may give you an idea of the number of wells that have been drilled, because the oil and gas industry in the United States goes back to before the Civil War, and there are absolutely no records on some of those wells at all. There was no permitting system. There was no regulatory agency that managed them. So it's difficult to go back and say, well, we know there's a well here. No, we don't have a clue.
So in a case like that where, there is no record and all that stuff, I mean, you kind of consider that, to be an orphaned well that is also a zombie well. I mean, those things are kind of overlapping. Who takes responsibility for something like that if you just don't have a paper trail on it or, trail of...
Typically right now in Texas, as far as Texas is concerned, it becomes onus of the Railroad Commission to take care of it.
Okay.
Which, is based on the taxpayer.
Right.
We've also had a lot of mergers and acquisitions over the decades, and you could have somebody that had drilled and produced a well and plugged it, and then they got bought out, then they got bought out, then they got bought out, and you come back and the well was plugged in the 50s and it had somebody else's name on it, and you really got to run the lineage to find out who exactly is, the current operator who would be responsible for it. So it's a lengthy process. I mean, trying to locate them. Met with some people that, not long ago that are into magnometers and drones and and having, being able to detect methane emissions and things of that, but then trying to fly that and trying to identify. I mean, Texas is huge, and trying to fly the whole state and try to get an accurate count and locate these things. At this point in time, even though we do have satellites that are flying over us and looking for this stuff, it's going to be a huge undertaking to be able to locate and identify and manage this problem in the future.
Interesting. When I'm like, this is me being naive and not knowing a ton about like kind of how all this works logistically, but I feel like there's oil, right? So there's got to be an economic benefit somewhere, or is it just these just have to be plugged and like there's nothing we can really do to recover anything? This is my other thought is like, could you say, okay, we've got 10 companies have owned this well over the past decade, so we're gonna split the cost out over. I don't like, is there
8 of those companies are bankrupt. Okay, like.
I get it. But that's kind of my point is like the ones that are even responsible are bankrupt. So like, where do you pin the tail on the donkey? It just seems kind of like it's a big mess. I don't know. I got no ideas. I just got questions.
The primary person or entity that's responsible is the regulatory agency in the state. If ownership cannot be identified, if the owners are bankrupt, if they simply do not exist anymore, then the wellbore is considered an orphan. It doesn't have a daddy anymore, and the regulatory agency is responsible for plugging it. Now, that's for orphaned wells. For wells that have been plugged, either plugged improperly or it was plugged properly at the time, but now it's deteriorated and started leaking, the responsibility pathway is not really very clear. In some cases, it's the operator that existed prior to a certain date, like 1997, or it was somebody who will step up and voluntarily take on the replugging responsibility, and those guys are pretty rare. And it goes back to what Wade was saying. A bunch of these guys no longer exist. The company is either defunct or it is closed up, or there simply is not a revenue source available to plug these wells. And the result is we end up with the problem that Hawk has been facing out in West Texas. There just isn't anybody to plug them. And that's really what complicates the issue from both an engineering and an operations standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a few things, that as I understand, maybe in Louisiana and offshore with Bessie, that they do spread the plugging liability amongst the operators who have actually produced the well. So on a percentage basis. So if you produce 60% of the well, then you're on the hook for 60% of the plugging liability, and it's spread out, like you said, amongst operators. And if, one operator is bankrupt and, let's say, we have 5 operators who've had their hands on the well. If one of them's bankrupt and defunct and can't be found, then, then it's amongst the other 4. Kind of what we're facing here in Texas is the bonding is too cheap. And we're going to continue to have this problem if we don't start trying to keep our industry, self-supporting. And Texas is divided up into districts as per the railroad commissions, and you kind of you have a good idea how much, a well costs per foot, in each district and what the average is. And if you add that on to the drilling permit, it goes into the fund and that money stays with that API number throughout the life of the well. You start to try to avoid this in the future. That's looking forward. What we're facing right now is thousands of wells that need to be plugged that end up, becoming a burden on the taxpayer. And we're going to really have to sit down and do some hard thinking of how we're going to address that so that we can get caught up. And Texas has led the way. I spent pretty much 27 years overseas, and Texas has always been the proving ground for new technology, as far as drilling, and folks come over here to learn, and the technology is proven over here, and then it's exported overseas and makes the trip around the globe. As far as drilling, completions, and production, and we really need to incentivize changing the way that we plug these wells in the future. and start leading the way in how we plug and abandon and retire these assets. And, it can be done. There's new material out there. There's new technology. There's a lot of young people that, have some fantastic ideas of how to approach this. And we need to bring them into the fold and start listening to them a little bit because, like I said, there's people out there with digital technology that I can't even, pronounce. And we got to start using these young people and using their minds and helping us old guys start to address this problem, working together.
Are there people that you're kind of like looking to for, or maybe people, companies, discussion groups that maybe you've kind of gravitated towards of being like, hey, they got some good ideas? Or is this still where, there's not really defined direction yet? Or are there groups that are talking about this maybe more at length? And obviously, you're going through the paces of bringing it to everyone's attention too, but are there other places that we could kind of learn maybe all sides of this discussion?
Yeah, there has been a good deal of work done in various aspects of technology for plugging these poor things. There's been a lot of recent improvements in cementing, for example, both cement types and placement of the cement. And that is valuable technology. And so we're constantly keeping our eyes open for new products, new procedures, people who can actually plug wells. There are a number of folks out there that believe that they can plug wells, and they simply follow the old standards, the old way of doing things, and they're trying to use the excuse that they're using tried and true technology. Well, it's been tried, but it certainly isn't very true, and otherwise the wells wouldn't be leaking. That is one of the issues that we have with many of the regulatory agencies. They simply haven't kept up with new technology, and as a result, an operator, for example, that's trying to plug a well, will submit a permit, and it uses the same old tired technology that's been used and failed in the past, and the Railroad Commission or the OCC or the NMOCC or whatever the regulatory agency is simply rubber stamps it and says, yeah, go ahead and do it. That sounds fine to us, without really digging into the fact that this well was properly plugged using the state of the art at the time, the materials at the time, the regulations at the time, and now it's leaking. Well, obviously, the old tried and true technology didn't work.
Now, I'm being a bit facetious here and kind of making a joke, but we all know that the cement companies have a lab, and in the lab there's a mad scientist, and I picture him in a white jacket and with horn rim glasses, and and he's always designing something, and there's lightning and sparks and everything else, and he's always coming up with something better, and they do, and they keep them locked up in the laboratory, and we have an opportunity to be able to try some of these new techniques and start using them. I've got a landowner out here with over 200 orphan wells on his place, and there's not a better laboratory to start trying new cement and new things like polymers and epoxies and have a 200 plus orphan well laboratory. It's not like we're ever going to bring these wells back. There's everything imaginable in these wells, where there's holes in casing, there's fish, there's all kind of things that the industry is going to face all the time, and there's not a better place to have a laboratory and start trying to use some of these new techniques and materials and get some stuff proven up and start doing a better job. I've said it before. I've had basically a cadaver farm of wells that were plugged from the late 60s all the way up to 2023, and we've proven that the current material that we're using right now is not a long-term solution for asset retirement, and we really need to start looking forward and start getting with these little mad scientists and say, okay, what do you got for me? And let's try it and see how it goes. And, if it doesn't work and it fails, we'll just drill it out and we'll try something else. And that's the only, this is the oil field. We've tried, it failed, and tried and failed. Oh, this works. And let's try and see if it works again. Oh, it works 2 or 3 times. Okay, great. We got something new. And that's kind of the way we need to approach P&A.
To support what Hawk is saying there is that our knowledge of cement technology goes back a couple of thousand years. The Romans actually used volcanic fly ash mixed with quicklime, and they made all kinds of port facilities in the Aegean Sea. Those still exist. And one of the reasons they exist is they also mixed in a little bit of calcium carbonate or limestone into that cement, so that when the seawater invaded the body of the cement through cracks or pores or whatever else, it created a calcium carbonate seal to those cracks. In other words, the cement was self-healing. We have that same technology. We've had it all along, but we're still using cements that were actually in existence for some time, but we didn't even have a classification program from API until 1953 on cements. So right now we have old cements and old technology that is acceptable, but we have so much new technology, it's hard to keep up with.
I think that's kind of where some of my questioning goes on that is, if the old methods are, obviously not holding up over time and we're wanting to try new methods, I mean, it feels like some of the iteration process there could be decades, and so like, could we actually be making the process worse by trying some, what I'd say is untested solutions? Now, I love what you're saying there about, having some experience and things like that with cement standardization and what we're seeing here. And so it's really interesting to me on that. I guess one of the questions I had was in terms of the regulatory effect of it. I mean, do you feel like what they're requiring now in terms of like number of barriers and all that thing is sufficient? It's just maybe not the details or the type of cement that's really up to muster, or what is it there?
Well, the regulatory agencies they're pretty well steeped in tradition. What was used 2 years ago is going to be good enough. What was used 10 years ago has got to be good enough. And it goes back to the notion that sometimes the people in the regulatory agencies are very insightful. They understand that there are new products, but the policies and procedures that they use are still those that were used 20 years ago. There was a report written by the National Science Foundation back in 1976, and basically one of the things they noted was that a lot of the cement materials that we're using are the same ones we were using back in the early 20s. And in another report, they concluded that basically we're plugging wells today the same way we did 100 years ago. So we haven't really kept up, not only with the need, but with technology associated with either the number of barriers, number of plugs, or the type of plugs. And the placement techniques have not kept up with the current technology. When we talk about setting plugs in wells, for the most part, it was setting a plug inside the casing. Well, if the problem's on the outside of the casing, that plug on the inside of the pipe isn't going to do a whole lot.
Is the RCC saying like you can only use this material or this process? I mean, is it that granular to where, that's all been predefined? Or is it like, look, we're just going to, whatever comes across our desk, we're going to stamp it. Doesn't matter what tech you guys use. I'm sure it's got to be pretty detail oriented in terms of how it is. But I mean, are they requiring the old way to be the way to do this? Or is there room for discussion on just like the materials used, right? I mean, is that allowed?
It's from my experience, it's been that we've been doing the same thing, in the past, and we're going to continue to do the same thing. I know some people have tried some different cement blends and had to get approval and had to wait 2 weeks for approval. It's bureaucracy, and we're not going to move forward unless we eliminate that and start, thinking a little bit broader and moving a little bit quicker on this thing. Because, like I said, Mr. Les said, we've been doing the same thing for decades, and nothing's really changed, and we really got to get over that hump and start focusing on the little mad scientist in the lab. He messes with it every day, and he needs a place to try it out and prove it. With all the orphan wells we've got, we don't have anything to lose. And a lot of the people that I've spoken to over the past year or so, they'll provide it for free, with no cost to the state. But the state hasn't been able to get them approved, and if they can't approve to use it, then how can we get it approved to use in the future?
The other thing I'm thinking about too, so I'm out in California and I sat down with an operator out here probably 4 or 5 months ago. And we were still, okay, are we going to ever get any well permits, right? Well, lo and behold, CalGEM grants us 1,000 well permits for next year. Everyone's wondering, okay, where the heck are we going to find people now to go actually, do this? And we'll figure it out. I mean, it's not a crazy number of well permits anyways. I think you guys do that every hour. But my thing is going back to people. It's like, who's going to train everyone to actually go through this and do it? Because if the problem is that big, you're going to need more people that are specialized or exclusively do this kind of thing, on a daily basis. Or maybe that's incorrect, but I mean, where are people going to get trained for this if it's that big of a thing we need to attack?
I think the answer to that is that we're going to have younger people, as Hawk has already mentioned, come in that can bring some fresh new ideas. In the past 10 years, there's been about a 60% loss of oil industry professionals, and it's primarily because most of them have retired or died off. Every time one of them retires and goes fishing for the remainder of his life, that body of corporate knowledge is lost. So the people who have actually developed the technologies for adequately plugging wells continually declines. That number declines every year. And you're right, there are no mentors for the young guys, so they look back at some old well file and, well, here's the way we plugged it back then. And so through the use of Xerox engineering, they just copy it and we do it again. There's the new stuff simply is not attempted.
Yeah. I was fortunate enough to come up with people like Mr. Les and take me under their wing and train me and yell at me and cuss me, and everything. But, I got a great education, and I think my generation, and I'm not speaking for everybody, but, I can see back through my career where, I probably should have spent a little bit more time with some young folks and been a little bit more patient and kind of shown them around and done a little bit better job of teaching. I mean, we train our people every day. The training industry makes millions every year, but we're not really teaching the guys that are coming up behind us, and I'm a little bit to blame for that. I realize that, I'm coming to the end where I'm starting to look like I want to go fishing for the rest of my life, and there's going to have to be some young folks come underneath me, and I'm going to have to show them the ropes so I can exit and leave things in good hands.
I love it. Wade, any other questions that you got that are kind of burning?
Yeah, I mean, being from Oklahoma, I don't get wrapped up tons in a lot of the Texas stuff going on. I've dealt with the Corporation Commission a few times out in the Granite Wash and in East Texas, but kind of behind the zombie well topic, is there something else there that's kind of a big focus for this upcoming kind of group of commissioners?
Well, it's, for me personally and statewide, and like I said earlier, we're injecting 30 million barrels a day in the ground in Texas, and the technology is there to recycle and repurpose this water. And these older well bores, they can't stand the pressure. The well designs were never, the wells were never designed to handle this this added pressure to them. And you start adding pressure to it, of course they're going to fail and they're going to start flowing. So, the immediate need right now is, to get everybody off high center and start getting some of this water produced and making the data centers use recycled produced water. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want to water my tomato plants with it, but I don't think we're there yet. But I think getting industry off of our groundwater and start putting this produced water to good use. And, of course, it has its pros and cons as well. But the biggest pro right now is, if we're recycling the water and we're not injecting it, we're not running the risk of polluting our groundwater and, re-entering one of these wells that were plugged, 50 years ago. It's not cheap. So, it's an added cost on the operator to have to go back, and an added cost on if they have to go back into these wells and replug them. So the easiest thing, or I shouldn't say easy, but the simplest thing to do right now is let's get our injection under control and let's start doing something else with that fluid and try to alleviate some of these burden on some of these old wells in the ground.
All right.
Yeah, incidentally, there's a number of organizations and even the geologists are now recognizing that there may be a use for some of these old wells, either the orphaned or the zombie wells, for some other purpose, such as carbon dioxide storage or hydrogen storage or some other purpose. The problem is the integrity that remains in the old wellbore simply is not going to support that very well. There is a large target out there of wells that could be reused or refurbished at a cost, but that cost is probably considerably less than re-drilling a new wellbore to replace it. So, for example, if you have a wellbore that's of sufficient diameter and you want to go for a deeper horizon, you might well be able to use one of these zombie wells and repair it in such a way by either using some technique like cement squeezing or running a new string of casing inside the old one and then reuse that wellbore for some purpose. But it's going to take not only industry, but it's going to take a change in regulatory attitude before we're able to really make a dent in that number. It's far easier to plug one of these things and hope that it remains dead for the next 1,000 years and than it is to re-drill it or re-enter it. And it's going to take a change in attitude across the board before that's going to happen.
Gotcha. Well, guys, we're coming up on our time here. I'm just still so thankful that I was able to have you guys on to come on and talk. I'm gonna have to pick up your book. I know that for a fact now after talking to you. Just constantly being a sponge. But give us a hand up, guys. Where can people find you, and how can we connect and support what you're doing?
Well, I'm all over social media at Hawk Dunlap. I'm on all the platforms and reach out. I tried to handle my social media myself, and I really try to be active with that. I figure if you've got enough time to type me a message or make a comment, then I need to take the time to try to at least like it or try to get back with you. So I'm pretty easy to find, and I'll be pretty much come January 2nd till the primary and March 3rd. I'm running for railroad commission, so I'll be all over the state and in the trucks. I love it when people come up and say hi or want to take a picture. I was at Sam's buying Topo Chicos, and then I get home and I get a message from a guy on TikTok say, "Hey man, I saw you in Sam's." I said, "Why don't you come over and say hi and help me load these Topo Chicos? Them boxes are heavy." "Well, I didn't want to mess with you. I was afraid you might." I said, No, come help. I need all the help I can get.
Yeah.
No, more than happy to speak with, and I really appreciate all the support that I've gotten thus far.
Yeah, and I'm
Awesome.
also available on social media as well. So if you look for me on LinkedIn or Facebook, you're going to find me. And if you can't get hold of me directly, you can always call Hawk, and he knows how to get in touch with me most of the time.
I love it. Well, guys, thank you so much for being with us. Guys, yeah, this has been great. We'll have this out tomorrow. Everyone that's listening, please look up Hawk, look up Les, check us out at localenergy.com, and we will see you again next week.